Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Educator Wellness Revolution podcast. And we're here today with Danielle Palmer and Monique Leopold. Thank you both so much for being here. And I'd like to start just hearing a little bit about you and how you came to do the work that you do, why you're interested in educator wellness, and what you're excited about right now. So can we start with you, Danielle?
Sure. So again, I'm Danielle Palmer and I'm a school psychologist, and I've worked in the DC schools in charter, public, and I kind of stumbled upon the educator wellness work. Of course, being in the schools, it was something that I've always participated in and tried to support, but just kind of more formally, a colleague asked us to work with them on a project, and Monique and I kind of just dove right into the literature and became like super excited and saw the intersection between our work, our trauma interests, and we've kind of been running with it since then.
Awesome. And how about you, Monique?
So similar to Danielle, I always call her my partner in crime. I'm also a school psychologist by profession. I've worked in both public schools and also charter schools, and have always been just really fascinated and passionate about the intersection of mental health and young people and education. And so Danielle and I, in doing that work, also are the practice group leaders for the DC community of practice through the Behavioral Health Expansion Grant. And so in doing that, have been having lots of conversations, obviously, about trauma-informed practices in schools, which has lended itself to talking about educator and student wellness. And so, as Danielle mentioned, we stumbled upon it on a project that we collaborated with some colleagues, and really had an opportunity to dig deep into the research of educator wellness and looking at the components of stress, teacher burnout. And so here we are talking about it. It's something that we're both really passionate about and get to talk about a lot, which we really like.
Well, and I have to say that when I met you two and I found out our connection, which I'll explain in a second, I was like celebrities, because through Empower Ed, we are one of the Aussie grantees, which is our state superintendent of education here. And we're doing school wellness. And part of what this grant was about was a 3-tiered approach. And as soon as Scott and I saw this 3-tiered approach, we're like, this is everything. It's all what we've been learning, that like teacher wellness is not about teachers managing their stress better. It's about the system also changing so it doesn't create so much stress. So anyway, when I found out that you all were the ones who like helped to write that institute and brought the pyramid in, it's just been like really so helpful, and people automatically get it when we show it to them. And I really think that even just bringing that framework in has just done a lot for educator wellness. So
literally every time we have a workshop, people are like, and I really like how like you showed us that pyramid at the beginning, and like I really like how the individual is the smallest part of it, so you really know it's not all just on us for our wellness, like there's deeper things below it. So it is the foundation of like really getting that understanding that this is going to be different, that we're going to approach wellness more holistically. So it's really, really great to hear from both of you. And I know that, you're dealing with this every day, but, unfortunately, we've just seen such a uptick in traumatic events. And many of our current school partners in Washington, D.C., as well as just schools throughout the district and in our school communities. And so wanted to see if you could maybe walk us through a timeline of how a school ideally handles a traumatic incident, and both in ways that it's going to address the student wellness, but also the staff.
Sure. I think one thing when we're thinking about the timeline too, and the way that we describe this might not necessarily be a timeline, but the things that we feel like are really important when traumatic events are happening in a school, and just also in gathering information from some of our colleagues, some of our teacher friends, some of our friends who work in schools who have really actually experienced events, and kind of picking their brain on what does this and should this look like for you. I think the thing that comes up just first and foremost is this idea that the school community should just name what happened. And in doing so, that definitely creates a culture of making sure that students and staff feel validated. And it also just normalizes this idea that traumatic events do happen grief and loss does happen. And so I think first and foremost, just making sure that schools are naming this is what happened, and our community is impacted by it. I think the second thing is also just making sure schools have some sort of crisis plan or protocol that in that protocol make sure that it addresses student and staff members and our families. So a lot of times too, when we experience traumatic events in school, we have to make sure that we're thinking about our families. The student support is the thing that I think is the go-to a lot. So when an event happens, how are we going to support our students? And a lot of that centers around making sure that, staff are continuing to create safe and supportive and consistent spaces for kids. This idea that with grief, everyone wants to feel like they can fix grief, that they can take it away. But sometimes for our students who are experiencing these events, it's this idea of just being okay with being present for them. And then with the teacher support, again, we oftentimes forget our teachers and our staff, and a lot of that support needs to happen around helping staff understand how to manage their own emotions and supporting them and supporting the kids, because again, grief and trauma feel like these really daunting things that happen and they're hard. But how do we support our teachers and our staff in giving them the information of like, how do grief and trauma show up? What are some things that you are going to see, and how well do you feel prepared to handle different situations that might actually come up in your classroom, in the hallways? And then also, I would say just making sure that teachers feel safe. And again, that they're checked on, that they're asked, are you okay? How are you doing? Because I think that that's a really important piece to making sure that schools are addressing incidents in a way that is acknowledging that this thing happened.
Yeah, and I love that just obviously making sure we recognize that the impact is also on our educators, but the explicit asking of how they're doing. Danielle, do you want to add anything onto that?
I think Monique summed it up really well, but I think just really emphasizing that giving teachers that time and that space, because when you think these things happen, typically we're back in school the next day and we're trying to just kind of figure out what to do, and teachers don't often get that space before they're in front of kids. So thinking about when you think about your crisis plan, like where do you provide that space for teachers to kind of gather themselves before having to be in front of kids to support the kids? And one thing I think also would be really helpful just as a team is just reflecting on that crisis plan after a crisis happened. So we had this plan in place. It looks great on paper, but now we had to implement it. What things went really well? What things maybe do we need to tweak, or what did we notice? What feedback did we get? Get that feedback from your team. Like how did you all feel after, we operated this way for the day, and then think about like how you can continue to revamp that plan. We do a lot of drills. We have a lot of, things written down, but when you're in the moment, you learn a lot about the process, about what people actually need. And then you can kind of think about like, okay, how do I go back and make sure that everyone feels supported? Like we may have nailed it with the kids, but our staff was really suffering. So how do we go back and revamp our plan to make sure that everyone feels safe, supported, and connected in those moments?
What I hear and what you're saying is that like space for reflection is really to not look at it like, well, we did that and that's done and we have to move on, but you need to go and look back and be able to learn for the future, that it's an ongoing process.
Absolutely.
And I'm also struck just by the simplicity of some of it. And I want people to hear this. So I think that sometimes in moments where something really hard happens, I know I can feel this way. Like I have to say the perfect thing. I have to be the best listener in the world. And really it is just about like naming and listening and giving space and time, which we all know that for teachers, space and time are like the two biggest commodities.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's not an easy thing, but just to remember that it doesn't have to be the biggest, fanciest thing, but it really is just about like saying it and communicating that. And well, something else that we've noticed working with partner schools is there are sadly these immediate traumas that are happening, but there's also, as we start to look at especially the staff culture, and we start to dig back and find out about a traumatic thing that happened like 2 years prior that never really got addressed. And we see that a lot of the outcroppings of school imbalance come from some of these traumatic incidences that weren't addressed well in the moment. So I would love to hear how you see this connection around like immediate trauma response and also the ongoing culture of staff wellness and how those two things fit together.
Definitely a connection between kind of staff wellness and kind of like trauma response. One thing that we've kind of talked about in a lot of our work is just kind of thinking about like, how do we go beyond just that immediate moment? Again, we have those plans for like those immediate crises, but we don't think about what that looks like long-term and how do we continue to foster this space of wellness for our educators. Is usually like, we have the crisis, we have these things implemented, and then like the next week it's like back to business as usual. And so really challenging our school partners when we talk about these things in our COP or our practice groups, just thinking about like, what's that long-term plan to where we're continuously kind of coming back to this idea of wellness, or helping them understand how grief works. And it's not just this nice thing that's wrapped up nice and neatly in a bow after this, the week that this thing is passed. So really just kind of honing on like, what are those kind of like long-term things that we're really trying to implement so we can continue with this like idea of wellness beyond the tragic incident.
I love that. And can you actually just walk us through how grief does work? Because I think it's one of these things we assume we all know, but how, in your experience, like what should people be thinking about when they're thinking about a school culture that's grieving? I don't know, Monique, you want to jump in with that one? Or
Sure. Yeah. And we, Danielle and I we work really closely with partners at the Went Center. And so Went Center defines grief as change plus loss. And so, a lot of times with grief, right, we think it just has to also be a death-related incident that happens. And so when Danielle was talking about just this education around grief, so like, what are the things that students and staff could be grieving about, right? Grief doesn't live, trauma doesn't live kind of in this bubble that, okay, someone died. It could be anything that happened that was something that changed, something plus something that somebody lost, and that could be a person. It could be some sort of object. But this idea that there are ebbs and flows, right? So just because someone is grieving doesn't mean that they can't also be in the presence of joy. And so I think this idea that grief means sadness and darkness and kind of isolation. It's a really hard concept to understand that you can also be grieving, but also feel at times joyful and happy. And so I think a lot of the tier 1 information that we've been trying to promote to schools is around this idea of this is what grief can look like. This is how grief works. And again, just this idea that grief doesn't always and also go away. And so that's why, again, this idea of coming up with a plan for a school community, it has to almost be a plan for like week 1, month 1, a few months down the road, with just these continual check-ins, because after an event happens, people are still grieving, and it might manifest and show up in different ways for both staff and students.
Yeah. I mean, as you talked about, like these can, when the event occurs, obviously there's a need for just the immediate support and the long-term support, but also these are happening in environments where there already are traumas, where there already are, where there already is a lack of a wellness culture in the school. And so sometimes, the moment where they're going to bring in a partner to deal with something is that explicit moment of trauma, of grief among the staff, but then they're going to peel back the onion a little bit and see actually there's a lot more that was there already, right? And so there's everything the school already had underlying it in a culture of wellness or a lack of it, and then the grief and trauma that kind of builds on top of it. And a lot of this often falls upon the school leader to get the strategy right and also set the tone, and how they act themselves and how they right? Do we get right back to things? Do we actually make the space for this? But I want to just hear from you a little bit about how you coach principals to be responsive and help the healing process at their schools.
That's a great question. I think one thing that we encourage our principals to do is to be human, be vulnerable in those moments, to kind of acknowledge that this is hard. And that this is, something that's difficult to deal with. I may be struggling with that. So one, just kind of showing that human side. I think, Scott, as you said, like principals feel like I have to fix everything, I have to have everything lined up, it has to be perfect. And then they don't get that moment to kind of just be human. And sometimes staff can connect with that. I'm just saying, like, this is a really difficult time, and just, like being human and normalizing kind of what's going on and what they're experiencing is something that we really encourage our principals to think about and try to connect with their staff. I think also we try to encourage them, just again, as Monique was sharing, just to have like a understanding of what grief looks like, what this could mean in their school community, so they can recognize the different ways that this may show up for their staff and their students. So just kind of making sure that they're really knowledgeable about what this looks like, because it's not in any of our principal training manuals or like your education or things like that. So these are things that they're learning as they go along. So really trying to make sure that they have that knowledge and understanding. Things do you want to add, Mo?
Yeah, I think also as we talk about educator wellness and this framework, I think what is really helpful for principals, and I know we are trying to spread the message of this, but just getting their understanding and making sure that they have an understanding of what educator wellness is and what the components are that contribute to educator wellness. And so the first thing is kind of their like buy-in of how important it is to make sure that your students, that your staff are well, because that, research tells us that has significant impacts. When your staff is well, you see positive results for students. And so just on the surface level, having conversations with them about educator wellness. And then I think just beyond that is having them just engage their community in sort of like a needs assessment, right? And so I think sometimes with wellness, it's, some schools are like, yeah, we can like throw t-shirts, we can buy lunch, but I think that sometimes the engagement with your staff in a solutions focused way, like what is it that my community needs? What is it that they want? And then I think similar to what Danielle said, principals and being human and showing that humanistic side. I know staff really appreciate when they are in buildings, when they feel like admin are in the trenches with them, that they are also a team player, that, they have that kind of roll up their sleeves mentality, that they also, want to get in and they want to support, and that they acknowledge that this is really hard, but that wellness is also important. And I think a lot of that comes from even just wellness, this idea that just celebrating people, celebrating and acknowledging adults and the work that they do. And so Danielle and I are always talking about like, how can we push leaders to go sort of beyond that tip of the iceberg, because we want to make sure that there is like true change in the environment and the climate, because that ultimately impacts their adult culture. And so
well, it's so great to hear that articulated from the inventors of the pyramid themselves, that like, but that's exactly right what we always talk about when we introduce it, right? Which is like, we play this video at the beginning of our workshops where the principal's like, I had a choice between basically deeper educator wellness work or Chick-fil-A breakfast. So you can see I chose the Chick-fil-A breakfast. And like, it's a little bit teasing, but the reality is that we fall back on the things we know how to do often. And it's long, hard work for people to actually sit with a representative group of staff and go deeper and figure out what the school actually needs. What are the needs of that school community? And what we've learned from all of our work is that is really, really different in every school. There are commonalities about how student behavior, for example, is affecting the mental health and wellness of educators, or how cohesive the staff culture is. And how they feel bonded together as a team, or the degree to which they have or don't have flexibility in their job and the balance with their own personal lives. So there are themes that run across every school, but you really have to get a group of educators together at the school that's representative to figure out what is the plan that's going to work for us to get at those root causes. So I really love to hear you name that.
I think schools are really interesting places for wellness too, because social and emotional learning is named all the time. I was like being really important for students and we're doing this. And then I'm like, but what about the adults? Like, I think there's just this like belief that we have that when you turn 18, you've like gotten everything socially and emotionally that you need, which is, you all know it's not the truth.
Right.
So I think schools are these really ripe environments that like people have the vocabulary already and the students need it. And just to like bring that awareness to what's happening with the adults in the building, their own emotional lives and social lives. So it's, I think we just have to connect these two dots. That's what it feels like.
And I think this idea that wellness is multifaceted, right? So like wellness, how I define wellness might be different than how you, Gracie, define wellness. And I think that sometimes that can be like a tension in schools of, you know, like a consensus in trying to figure out what wellness means to the greater community, where, you know, some people might not feel like they can get wellness from their school community or school environment, while others are craving certain things. And so I do think it is kind of figuring out the unique needs of your school community and like, what does wellness look here in this particular building, in this community?
Absolutely. And this is why we are really passionate that like, we don't think this is like school wellness could be a module training that you could take, you know, like it has to be relationship based. It has to be the listening process and the looking at all the different assets of culture. Well, I would love to hear about any successes that you all have witnessed recently in terms of educator wellness, and they can be successes that you've helped to create or just what you've seen, because I think that the odds are, you know, they really do stack up sometimes around what the realities are. So we really need to like draw out these successes.
Absolutely, yes. Because otherwise it can feel really hard if you don't have these wins that you can kind of pull on. We in our community of practice, we have some schools that are doing educator wellness really well, and they're kind of figuring out different ways that they can kind of incorporate this kind of beyond, as Monique said, the tip of the iceberg, beyond the t-shirt, or things like that, where they're actually incorporating you know, getting information from their staff and kind of using that to facilitate, you know, different wellness strategies at different levels of the kind of pyramid and things like that. I can say Monique and I worked together at a school previously, and one thing that came up that was really challenging for our educators was just kind of understanding students with special needs and their behaviors, and just they were really struggling with our like high flyer kids, like our tier 3 kids. So we developed a like a teacher training institute kind of situation and partnership with Children's Hospital here in DC, where we had different doctors kind of come in and talk about different aspects of just understanding mental health, understanding the brain. And then Monique and I supplemented that information with, okay, now how does this apply to you in the classroom? And we had great success with that program. It was really fun for us to do because, again, you know, that's something that we're really passionate about, but it really helped us kind of, I think that may have been our first actually at moment where we looked at educator wellness kind of beyond just kind of like being okay, and kind of understanding that, you know, feeling knowledgeable and feeling successful in your job contributes to your wellness and, you know, your efficacy as a teacher and things like that. So that was one of our kind of one of our babies that we created at our previous school that really helped contribute. And the feedback we got from teachers was, you know, they felt more prepared in the classroom. They felt like they had a better understanding of some of their students' needs, and they felt, you know, like better as an educator. So that was one win that I think that was really meaningful for us. And like I said, really started to expand our thinking around like what educator wellness could really look like and mean.
That's awesome. That's awesome. You know, as we close out, I want to ask one more thing, which is just kind of, you know, this work doesn't always go smoothly, and not everybody's invested in it, right? Not everybody wants to do it, right? So how do you deal with opposition and when you meet opposition, and how do you maintain hope in the work, even when, you know, not everybody might be a willing partner, or that you might encounter obstacles that make it really tough?
I think one of the things is to think about the work and who and what it's in service of. And so as someone who's still in the schools, it's all about the kids. And so the work with the kids is, I think, what is the thing that helps me maintain hope, is that we are doing this work in service that kids can get the supports they need, that they can be successful, that we are working hard because we have this belief that they can be and do what they want. And also this notion that it takes a village, right? So when everybody steps up and everybody does their part and there's some level of accountability, it definitely creates this hopeful environment. But the work is hard and the work is tireless, and it's not very thankful often, but I think that in service of, student success and student well-being.
Yeah. I think when you see those small wins, you're like, oh, I've been putting in so much work or so much effort, and you see those small wins, whether it is, an impact directly on a student or a teacher that you've been working really hard to coach up to, be in the classroom. I think it's those small wins that really kind of keep you going. And you're like, okay, like it's worth it. The effort and the work is worth it. And I think also just honestly seeing the shifts that we're seeing in schools, currently. So Gracie, you were talking about just like understanding like social emotional learning and how that's being infused a lot for the kids. But for a while, that wasn't the case. School was all about you come here to learn and that's it. And so I really appreciate also just the direction that schools are moving in, to recognize that this is something that's important, and we're even talking about wellness, and we're even thinking about how are we going to support our educators, how are we providing students with skills that they need beyond math and reading. So that provides me a lot of hope to just say, like, we're getting it. Like, okay, we're starting to understand and we're starting to see those shifts within our educational system. So that gives me hope that we'll continue to go down this path, and that, things will, just be better for our students and our staff in the education environment.
Awesome. Thank you both so much, Dr. Danielle Palmer and Monique Leopold. You all have so much experience and wisdom, and I feel your energy, your enthusiasm is really inspiring too. So thank you for being here with us and sharing so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Thanks, everybody.